Let's talk about these discovery sessions, requirements discovery sessions. So far we've talked about how to put together the information. We need to identify events. We've talked about what is an event. We've talked about finding those events as we've gone through the business process diagram. We've talked about what's an object, what's a data attribute, what's the difference between the two. We've talked about the rules of attributing data to objects. We've talked about how to write the narrative. We've talked about the business rules table and how it works. So we've talked about all the stuff that's needed to be able to put together a business requirements document. And we've talked about putting together that document, organizing it, and distributing it in an effective way. What we haven't talked about a lot is the actual discovery session. How do we actually conduct that? Well, the whole idea of a discovery session is, of course, to get everybody in the room, whether it's you as an analyst or maybe there's a couple of you working together as analysts. And we call analysts pilots. And we have co-pilots as well, deputy analysts, if you like. Right? And the whole idea behind the idea of calling an analyst a pilot is because you got to bring that ship home. You got to land that plane within a certain amount of time. You have to lead the sessions. Some people call them coordinators, but I don't really like that because it's a leadership role. You have to take it forward with your subject matter expert. But whether you have one subject matter expert in the office with you or in a room with you, or whether you have 20, the whole idea is to get everybody to work on the same page at the same time and ultimately come to some kind of agreement. What it does during a discovery session when you have the subject matter experts right there in the room with you is that they will be able to transfer knowledge about their business to you ever so quickly. Remember that the questions you ask come from the business rules table. In this table, we typically use closed-ended questions. Closed-ended questions solicit yeses and nos. Maybes sometimes is really just a different version of yes and no at the same time. In other words, different options. Whereas open-ended questions are wonderful for discussions, and you want to have those sometimes too. But when you get to the actual business process, you want to be able to go right to the heart of the matter, in context, and ask clear and concise questions to which the subject matter expert can say yes, no, and you can move on through all the questions that you have. Once you've asked questions about all of the cells of intersecting objects that's for a process, then you've asked all of the questions that you need to ask in context about the business requirements. There may be other questions about technology architecture, solution design, and so forth, but that's not part of business analysis. That comes next. You have to do the requirements from the business perspective first, and then the rest of it comes a little bit later. And that's when you look at, the 27 options in terms of what are the different ways of doing things. So in that discovery session, you need to be able to ask the questions, you need to draw the picture, you need to get them to tell you about it, and you draw the picture accordingly. And one of the things that happens is that you get really high quality because it's their stuff, their information. Again, I want to reiterate that your subject matter experts in your company know their business as long as you're dealing with people who are experienced in that business. And you should be on a project. The organization shouldn't be risking a project that could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars. They shouldn't be risking that to somebody who's not experienced in the business. So they do know their business. It would be a shame, I think, if an analyst truly believes they know more about the business than the business folks themselves. Now, I know that sometimes seems to be the case. And it's not quite right. If you ask the questions well, and we've talked about how to find the questions to ask and how to ask those questions. If we ask the questions well, you will get answers from the business folks. There's no doubt about that. You'll get high quality as a result of that. And in the end, it's going to be provably complete. You'll know that there are no more questions to ask. So the document you result in, it could be an electronic document, not necessarily paper, that document is based on completeness rather than goodness and light. You know how sometimes we say, well, we have a good spec. What does a good spec really mean? You know, is it provably good? It has to do with completeness and accuracy and nothing else. And there has to be a way of measuring the completeness and accuracy. Now, we've talked about how to measure the completeness based on finding all the events and being able to ask all the questions. Now, there's a whole lot of detail about that in the textbook, the Mastering Business Systems Analysis textbook. So we're going over it here fairly quickly, but you do read that. You're going to find that you can become quite comfortable with that. And of course, it opens the door to success for you because you're working with the business people on their terms at that point. You're not using any technobabble. You're not creating your view of the system. You're looking at their view. And it's not the automated system you're looking at. You're looking at the business system without the technology, without the how do we do this. And then that comes next. There has to be an understanding, a stable view of the business, an understanding of what the requirements are, so that you can go on to the next step. So let's talk about how long this takes. Well, there are two kinds of discovery sessions. There's the project scope blitz, which we've talked about. It starts on the front end, and it usually takes about a half a day. For most systems, 90% it's going to take half a day. Sometimes it'll take a little bit longer, but most systems end up being, in the end, when you're all done, about 25 events in that neighborhood. How long does each event take, the detailed discovery session? Well, it takes about, this metric is based on over 850 projects. So there's got to be some measure of correctness to that. It takes about 1 hour with the clients and subject matter experts per event. So you get them together, discovery session, you plan when to do that, and that's going to take about an hour. You reserve an hour, put aside an hour. Almost everybody has an hour. Very few people have, well, when we get around to it, or how many interviews can we run? You can't run an interview with possibly 10 people in the room or 20 people in the room, which sometimes happen. You sometimes have subject matter experts where you have a dozen or 2 dozen subject matter experts related to one process. Can you imagine if you had a single process, regardless of what the process is, and you had to conduct interviews and check and double check everything, verify everything with 25 different people? It would take a long time to do that. That's why so few people actually do it. They talk to a couple of key people and they miss the other 2 dozen that have some very, very sound knowledge as well. So you want to be able to get them all into the room. And whether it's 25 people or whether it's 2 people, the subject matter experts, it's going to take an hour per event with your subject matter experts. Then it's going to take another 3 hours for each individual event, on average, to get all the followed-up documentation and all the details and so forth. So in other words, for a single event to do all of the documentation, on average, it's going to take 3 hours, or 4 hours, I should say. 1 hour with the subject matter experts and 3 hours of offline work. Well, that's interesting because a typical project then, not a tiny one, typical medium-sized project is going to be about 25 events. That means it's going to be 100 hours of analysis work. Now, somebody might say, and you can figure this out right away, as soon as you do the project scope blitz, you can find out approximately how many events there are. Well, once you find out that there's 100 hours of work, 25 with your subject matter experts, I'm sure that somewhere there's someone who says, that's too much time. Well, if they say that's too much time, I mean, this is based on over 850 projects now. Just ask them which part they'd like to not do. And they can take the responsibility for not doing that part. I mean, you can't not do the work. In 1 hour with subject matter experts to cover off a business process, it's not that much time. And the rest of it is a detail thing. How much detail you put into it is determined by the risk on the project. That's why we say it takes that on an average, because in some projects we spend a little bit of time on it. Other projects, we apply the 80-20 rule, we do a little bit less work. So you might find it's a little bit less after that 1 hour than the 3 additional hours that I've talked about. But it's very important to be able to say right up front, right after the project scope lists, this is how many events we have. If it's 25, so that means we have to have 25 hours with our subject matter experts. And we're going to have another 75 in all likelihood to do all the related detail. We'll be able to do that right up front.